"You don't have a case." My husband said it loud enough for half the courtroom to hear. A few people chuckled. Even his attorney smiled, as if the outcome had already been decided. I stood alone at the petitioner's table, holding a worn leather folder that contained 22 years of records I had never expected to use against the man I once loved. Daniel leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "You should have just signed the papers." "Rachel." I didn't answer. People often mistake silence for surrender. Then something changed. Judge Whitman opened a file that had just been delivered to his bench. He scanned the first page, frowned, and adjusted his glasses. The room waited. He read the page again. Then he turned to the second document and read that one twice as well. For the first time that morning, my husband's confidence disappeared. And when the judge finally looked up at me, his voice was completely different. "Mrs. Mercer," he said quietly, "where exactly did this file come from?" I was 44 years old when my marriage ended. At least, that's when the paperwork started. The truth was that it had been ending for years. Daniel and I had been married for almost 2 decades. When we first met, he admired my military background. Back then, he would tell people proudly that his wife had served as a JAG officer. He loved the uniform, the stories, and the respect that came with it. But admiration has a strange way of turning into resentment. When someone spends years standing beside a person they secretly feel threatened by, the change happens slowly. At first, it was little comments. "You still keeping all those old files? Nobody cares about military paperwork anymore. You act like what happened 20 years ago still matters." I laughed them off. Then I started putting things away. The framed photographs from my service years disappeared from the living room. The metal box went into a closet. The certificates were moved into storage. Every time I made myself smaller, life became easier, or at least quieter. Daniel liked quiet. He liked being the most important person in the room. The less attention my past received, the happier he seemed. When I left military service, I believed I was choosing family. I missed promotions. I turned down opportunities. I spent years supporting Daniel's career while he built a successful consulting business. I never regretted those sacrifices. What hurt was watching him rewrite history. By the time he filed for divorce, he spoke as if everything we owned belonged to him alone: the house, the investments, the retirement accounts, even the legal strategy, especially the legal strategy. "You can't beat me in court," he told me one night after moving out. "I don't need to beat you," I replied. "I just need the truth." He laughed, the same laugh I heard in the courtroom. The laugh of a man who believed he already knew the ending. What Daniel didn't know was that 3 weeks before the first hearing, I had received a certified letter from a federal records office. Inside was a document I hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. A document connected to a military investigation I had never discussed with anyone, not even my husband. And at the bottom of the final page was a familiar signature: Judge Harold Whitman. The same judge now sitting on the bench. The same judge who had just read my file twice. The second hearing drew a larger crowd than the first. Divorce cases rarely attract attention, but Daniel had spent years building a reputation in our community. Several business associates sat in the gallery behind him. A few mutual friends were there too. People always seem eager to witness someone else's downfall. I arrived early and took my seat without speaking to anyone. Daniel entered 10 minutes later, confident as ever. He shook hands, smiled, and acted more like a man attending a networking event than a court proceeding. When he saw me, he smirked. Still carrying that old folder around, he asked. I looked down at the worn leather case resting beside my chair, the same one that contained my military records, the same one he had mocked for years. Some things are worth keeping, I replied. He laughed, like old war stories. Several people nearby chuckled. I felt the familiar sting, but I kept my expression neutral. There was no point arguing with someone who had spent years deciding who I was. The hearing began. Daniel's attorney stood and launched into a carefully rehearsed presentation. According to him, Daniel had built the majority of the marital assets. According to him, I had contributed little beyond routine household responsibilities. According to him, I lacked the experience to understand the financial complexities involved. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so insulting. For years, I had reviewed contracts, investigations, and federal compliance reports that involved far larger numbers than anything being discussed in that courtroom. But Daniel knew the audience didn't know that, and he counted on it. At one point, his attorney gestured toward me. My client has always been the primary decision-maker in the family. Daniel nodded confidently. Then he added something he shouldn't have. Rachel still thinks she's some kind of military lawyer. A few people laughed again. This time, the sound lingered. I noticed Judge Whitman stop writing, just for a second. Then he looked toward Daniel, not angry, not amused, studying him, as if evaluating a witness who had just said too much. The judge's eyes shifted to the leather folder beside me, then to the sealed federal document resting on his bench. For several long seconds, he said nothing. The courtroom slowly grew quiet. Finally, Judge Whitman opened the file once more. He turned a page, then another. His expression changed, and for the first time all morning, he interrupted the proceedings himself. "Counselor," he said calmly, looking at Daniel's attorney, "before we continue, I have a few questions regarding Mrs. Mercer's prior service record." The smile vanished from Daniel's face. The courtroom remained silent after Judge Whitman's interruption. Daniel shifted uneasily in his chair. His attorney stood frozen for a moment before clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I'm not sure Mrs. Mercer's military history is relevant to the property division before the court." Judge Whitman didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed his glasses and looked directly at me. Something in his expression had changed. Not curiosity, recognition. A feeling I hadn't seen directed toward me in many years. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "you served in the Judge Advocate General's Corps from 2002 to 2014, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor, and during that time, you were assigned to a federal military fraud investigation involving housing contracts for deployed service members." The room grew noticeably quieter. I heard someone in the gallery lower a coffee cup onto a bench. "Yes, sir." Judge Whitman nodded slowly. "I thought so." Daniel looked from me to the judge. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on his face. The judge turned another page. This case involved allegations that military families were being charged for services that were never provided. I said nothing. There was no reason to. The documents could speak for themselves. Years ago, I had spent nearly 18 months investigating a network of contractors who had profited from military housing programs, while deployed families struggled to receive basic support. It wasn't glamorous work. No helicopters, no combat missions, no dramatic rescues, just long nights, thousands of pages of evidence, and families who deserved someone willing to fight for them. I remembered one mother sitting across from me in a temporary office near Norfolk. Her husband was deployed overseas, She had tears in her eyes because her children were living in a house filled with mold while paperwork disappeared through government channels. Most people never heard those stories, but I did, and I never forgot them. The investigation eventually exposed millions of dollars in fraud. Several contracts were terminated. Multiple families received compensation. Then I moved on with my life. Or at least, I thought I had. Judge Whitman closed the file halfway. I served on the review panel connected to that investigation, he said. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Daniel stared at me. You never told me that, he said quietly. I finally looked at him. You never asked. The words landed harder than I intended. Judge Whitman nodded once. Then he glanced toward Daniel and his attorney. Counselor, he said calmly, I believe neither of you fully understand who Mrs. Mercer is. The color drained from Daniel's face. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence seemed to make Daniel uncomfortable. He shifted in his chair and forced a laugh. Your Honor, with all due respect, we're here to discuss a divorce. My wife's military career doesn't change the facts. The words sounded confident, but the confidence was fading. Judge Whitman leaned back slightly. I agree, he said. Daniel visibly relaxed. Then the judge continued. Truthfully, Mrs. Mercer's military service is not what concerns me most. The relief disappeared from Daniel's face. Judge Whitman opened the file again. This concerns me. He lifted a document from the folder. The court received supplemental financial records yesterday evening. Daniel's attorney immediately straightened. Financial records, yes. The judge turned a page. Records that appear to contradict statements previously submitted to this court. The room became perfectly still. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning overhead. Daniel looked at his lawyer. His lawyer looked at the judge. Neither looked comfortable. Judge Whitman continued. According to these records, several assets were transferred into secondary accounts approximately 14 months before the divorce filing. Daniel swallowed. His attorney spoke carefully. Your Honor, I'm sure there must be an explanation. Perhaps, the judge replied. But what interests me is who identified the discrepancy. His eyes moved toward me. The gallery followed. Every face in the room turned in my direction. She did. Nobody laughed this time. Judge Whitman set the document down. Mrs. Mercer discovered the transfers, traced the transactions, and documented the movement of funds before this case was ever filed. Daniel stared at me. You investigated me. His voice sounded smaller now. I met his eyes. No. I paused. I followed the evidence. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Whitman nodded. The same skills that exposed federal fraud years ago appear to have exposed something else. The words landed heavily. Daniel's confidence finally cracked. For years, he had convinced himself that I was weak because I was quiet, that I was uninformed because I didn't argue, that I was dependent because I chose peace. Now the room was discovering what he never bothered to learn. Silence is not ignorance. Restraint is not weakness. Judge Whitman removed his glasses. Mr. Mercer, he said, I believe you spent years underestimating your wife. Nobody came to Daniel's defense. Not his attorney, not his friends, not a single person. The room belonged to the truth now. And for the first time since our marriage began falling apart, Daniel looked genuinely afraid. The hearing ended differently than Daniel had imagined. The court ordered a full review of the disputed financial records. Several asset transfers would be investigated. Certain claims made in previous filings would have to be verified. Nothing dramatic happened. No one was arrested. No one was thrown out of the courtroom. Real consequences rarely look like television. They look like truth arriving one document at a time. As people began filing out of the courtroom, conversations started in low whispers. For the first time all day, nobody was looking at me with pity. They were looking at Daniel. I gathered my papers and returned them to the old leather folder, the same folder he had mocked, the same folder he thought represented a life that no longer mattered. As I reached the courthouse hallway, I heard footsteps behind me. Rachel. I stopped. Daniel stood a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked older than he had that morning, not physically, emotionally, like a man suddenly forced to confront a version of reality he had spent years avoiding. "I didn't know," he finally said. There was regret in his voice, real regret, not the regret of getting caught, the regret of understanding too late. I nodded slowly. "I know." He looked down at the floor. "You never told me any of it." The words might have hurt once. Years ago, I would have defended myself, explained myself, tried to make him understand. Not anymore. "You never asked," I said gently. The silence between us felt different now. Not angry, just honest. Daniel swallowed hard. I was wrong. I believed him. But belief and repair are not the same thing. For years, I had waited for him to see me, to respect me, to understand the parts of my life that existed before him. Now, I realized something important. I didn't need that anymore. "For a long time," I said quietly, "I thought I needed your approval to feel proud of who I was." His eyes filled with emotion. "But I don't. The words weren't cruel. They were simply true." Daniel nodded. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. I walked down the courthouse steps and into the afternoon sunlight. The marriage was ending. The legal process wasn't over. But something far more important had ended that day. The habit of making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. And that was a victory no court could ever award. One of the most important lessons in life is that you should never make yourself smaller just to make someone else comfortable. The people who truly value you will not ask you to hide your accomplishments, your sacrifices, or your story. Sometimes the greatest strength is not proving yourself to others. It is quietly knowing your worth, even when no one else sees it. Rachel's journey reminds us that truth does not need to shout to be powerful, and dignity never goes out of style. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments which moment stayed with you the most. Share where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories about honor, strength, resilience, and quiet justice, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story.